Hello, we're going to get started now. Thank you for coming in. As these days get more and more beautiful, I'm appreciative that everyone still comes to our programming, but you couldn't miss today's, right? So today's talk is with Nassim Taleb. He was a Wall Street trader for 20 years, as many of you know, who traded in, pun intended, his trading to become an academic, and has since been writing about the work that he's done and bringing together the research and practice from his 2 points of view. Today he'll discuss his best-selling book that many of you probably know about, The Black Swan. It's on sale outside, and we'll have a book signing after this. And he's also going to talk about a new book, Antifragility, The Necessity of Disorder, that is supposed to be published this fall. And the title may change because he took a call from someone in my office, and they were discussing the title. So anyway, be on the lookout for that. Perhaps he'll come back and do a signing for that as well. Published in 2007, The Black Swan focuses on the extreme impact of certain kinds of rare and unpredictable events and humans' tendency to find some simplistic explanations for these events retrospectively. This sort of reminds me of when, the kids are little and say, "Why is the grass green?" And after you've exhausted every sort of scientific explanation, you just say, "'Cause it is." So hopefully I think his work is more profound than that. The book has been credited with predicting the banking and economic crisis of 2008, and I'm sure he will go into that in more detail. And a review of the book by the Sunday Times called it one of the 12 most influential books since World War II. So that is quite an honor, and we're very honored to have him here today to speak. So after he speaks, we'll do our usual Q&A, and as always, we'll preference students. So students, please think of your questions, come down to the mics when you're ready to ask them, and we'll have a good talk. Thanks.
Hi there, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Hopefully I'll figure out how this works. Let me see if it works. Does it work? It does work, no? Okay, so too bad. I was hoping for a little bit of randomness in this and to define what is fragile to random events. I like the idea to illustrate the fragility of technology because we have a trade-off in life. You have gains in efficiency that always almost always come with losses somewhere. In other words, an increase in fragility. So I'm going to talk about that. But first, let me ask you, what is the opposite of fragile? Who said robust? All right, okay, student. Let me put my glasses. See how many people are going to say robust. What else? Durable, all right. Okay, what else? Sturdy, all right. Some other words? Okay, so that's a common mistake because let's look at this package, all right? This package is fragile. You're shipping this item to the North Pole where, on time before the wedding, all right? If the package is fragile, you write handle with care on it. So a fragile package has, once we define fragility, for upper bound, okay, unharmed. Agree? If it were robust, what would you write on a package? So you're shipping now a different kind of wedding gift to the North Pole, right? What would you write on it on a robust package? Nothing. You would not write, "I don't care," something. Okay. You won't. All right. So once we're going to now have a definition of fragility. Once we write it down mathematically, we'll realize that the opposite of fragile is definitely not robust. Okay. It is something. The opposite would be a package on which we would write, "Please mishandle." Okay. Because fragile is what is harmed by disorder, whatever, by the mishandling, and the opposite would be what gains from disorder, gains from mishandling, gains from. Okay, so there's no word for it, and I've tried. I'm sure someone's going to come up to me, during wine, and because we have foreign students here, and explain that in his native language there is a word for anti-fragile. There's none. Okay, I've tried all languages. All right? Not all languages, like 68 languages. All right? So there's no word for something that's the opposite of fragile, in common vocabulary. In actions, we are aware of that property, of course. Of course, we have a lot of saying. But, and in mythology, we'll see they are mythological equivalent. But there's no word in common language. And it is a problem. Why? Because, I was driven, largely driven to find a common word for what we call antifragility, but technically I call it philostochastic. Loves volatility, loves stressors, loves randomness. After reading a book on perception of colors that explained that Homer did not have, during the days of Homer, there was no word for blue. People were not biologically colorblind, they were culturally colorblind. And even a lot of populations don't have a word for blue, but they can match colors properly, okay? So we are aware of that intuitively, but not culturally, of that property of antifragility. And we're going to see ramification can be quite severe. Let me show, well, the representation in time series, okay, is fragile what has small gains, okay, and large losses. So the upper bound is, for a package is 0. It's not going to improve at all. But if it improves a little bit, that is a fragile. You can see it from financial packages. That is a robust. The robust, upper bound unharmed, lower bound unharmed, or close to, unharmed. And of course, the anti-fragile is something that gains, that has much more upside than downside. Now, let's go to mythology. If you recall the first slide, can someone recognize the animal? Hydra. Okay, very good. Hydra, in Greek mythology, you cut one head to grow back. So the last thing you need is harm it. The robust, what would the robust be in Greek mythology? Phoenix. Phoenix is you kill it, it comes back. That's the robust. So let's get deeper into this, but let me tell you where I'm going to take you, okay? I started defining and looking at the world. It's okay, I'll manage. Looking at the world in 3 categories. The fragile, the robust, and the antifragile. The antifragile is what gains from disorder, but you think that if it gains from disorder, it means that it's going to be hungry for disorder. And if you don't give it disorder, it's going to suffer, okay? The robust, of course, doesn't need disorder, doesn't care. And the fragile is what breaks under stress. So you can have a very simple mapping of things, about 100 categories of things, 100 domains. In economics, debt makes you fragile. Robust equity is robust for the structure, and of course, venture capital has this what we call long philostochastic attribute, in other words, benefits from shocks and uncertainty. So I built this triad, I call it a triad, as a replacement to forecasting. I call this a very non-predictive method. And let's look at the problem of forecasting. The central problem in a black swan was that the problem is that you cannot forecast these events. Mathematically, it is impossible to be precise about small probabilities. Empirically, it's almost impossible, okay? It has been very, very rare for people to predict events. So you can look at it in the records, particularly in what I call the fat-tailed domain. But mathematically, it's very, very hard. It's what we call the problem of induction. And it applies with full force to rare events. You don't have a large sample. If you're basing yourself on empirical methods, you don't have a large sample. Okay, 100-year floods happen once every 100 years. So if you have 50 years of data, you're not going to see it. Okay, and so rare events are not predictable empirically. visibly. You need a lot of data. For a lot of things we don't have enough data. And that's assuming you believe that the past is relevant. And mathematically, small perturbation, I'm going to use the very same technique that I will use to define fragility to show you why they're very fragile. These small probabilities are very fragile to model error. So so instead of forecasting, measuring plus people use in the English language, and I'm sure Danny Kahneman would confirm that the use of certain words, people start, imagining that they can measure the future, they can forecast, they can measure risk simply because you provide them with a certain framework, okay? If you tell people, instead of use the word measure risk or measure probability of rare events, if you tell them that you're prophesizing, for example, they would be a lot more careful. So there are a lot of psychological issues involved in the words we use. In Semitic languages, to predict means the way you say it in Arabic, for example, is to prophesize. So you're very careful about prediction if you use Arabic. But if you're using Wall Street lingo and you say I'm measuring the probability of some event, you have the illusion of measuring something that doesn't exist, okay? You have this illusion of measuring the way you would measure the stable, okay? So this is a problem prediction, and the triad is a replacement to prediction. I don't have to measure a future event. I can, and we're going to see now, there's a technique to figure out fragility, to measure fragility. It's vastly more measurable with much smaller error rate than the probability of future events. So let me figure out where I am here in these slides, and let's get there. All right. Let me show you a few things. For example, you know which item here is more fragile, no? Very simple. You see gains. Some of you may not recognize one of the items, the one on my right, all right? Okay, some of you is school, all right. The one on the left visibly is vastly more fragile. I have files, computer files. My first, popular book or non-technical book, Fooled by Randomness. I have the files on a diskette. 12 years ago, I can't retrieve them. Okay, this book is 505 years old. The one on the right. If you can read I don't know, if you can read a newspaper, you can read this. So, the one on the right. So, you see gains in technology come with increases in fragility. I use a certain method. The way I mean, my statements about the crisis were very simple. If something, I can't predict what will happen in the future, but if someone is using predictive methods and building fragile items based on these predictive methods, these items are going to break. So I can predict who's going to blow up based on the reliance on prediction. Banks, for example, they predicted a lot. When you have debt, you need to be predictive. Debt maps one-to-one with overconfidence about the future. Small mistakes wipe you out. So for someone to have a lot of debt, it means that they think they're not going to make mistakes. Look at government forecasting for any economic number, okay? Oil prices today should have been $22 a barrel, according to the Office of Management and Budget. And we trust them now with a forecast of what's going to happen in 2012, 2013, 2014, okay? So the people, when they are very predictive, they build something very fragile. When they're not relying on prediction, they have redundancies in the system that make them a lot more robust and sometimes anti-fragile. So I was asked by The Economist to predict what was going to happen the next 25 years, thinking that they asked me thinking I was going to overreact, but say you can't predict. I filled out the sheet, all right? They said, what, are you the author of The Black Swan or some imposter, or did something happen to you, all right? And I told them, no, of course. I can, it's very simple. Most people predict the future by taking the present as baseline and adding flying motorcycles, all these kind of stuff to the future. So it's much easier to take the present and project the future by removing. I don't know what the future will add. I know what time will remove. Okay, anything fragile is likely to go bust. Okay, and effectively the technique works. If you take what is it, I'm going to show you how this technique works. All right, you recognize these items. Okay, this is a kitchen, a Pompeii kitchen. Right, glass, 3,000-year-old. Things that are very old have staying power simply because they're not fragile. Technology is very fragile. Technology comes and goes. The future will be technological, but not with the current technologies. And effectively, the very simple application of something called the Lindy effect is if a technology is 100 years old, you can expect it to last an extra 100 years. Time is a very good detector of fragility. If a book has been in print for 15 years, you can expect it to be in print for an extra 15 years. In the absence of other information, it's just very statistical, just as you would predict someone's life expectancy from his age and no other information. And when you see an old person and a young person, you can expect a young person to outlive the old person for humans. Anything non-perishable, the young will outlive the old. Anything perishable. I mean, we humans happen to be perishable. Not our genes, but we are perishable. But for items that are not perishable, like cultural items, things that don't decay, the opposite holds. And for every day technology lives, it's likely to live an extra day. And you see it in the data. You see, and then again, that's an application of fragility. So let me continue with the things. This is taxonomy of things that are equivalent when I talk about fragility, and in a few minutes I will define fragility, and we're going to see all maps together. What the anti-fragile gains from these, and the fragile loses from these, which is the equivalence is uncertainty, variability, imperfect and incomplete knowledge, chance, chaos, volatility, disorder, entropy, time, the unknown, randomness, turmoil, stressors, and error. Is this working when I stand here? I don't have to get close to the microphone, no? Okay, all right. True, these may be taught at Princeton in different departments in different buildings, okay? But they have the same phenomenology, although in theory we don't know why these have the same effect. What happens when something is anti-fragile, is craving randomness, and you choke it of randomness. You don't give it randomness. You see what's up top? This is a natural system. It always has randomness. If you do at the bottom what Alan Greenspan did here, try to eliminate the business cycle by stabilizing artificially the system, you eliminate randomness, and the system craves randomness. You end up, what we have here is you don't have fluctuation, but then the busts are going to be horrible. People who are familiar with forest fires would see an equivalence there. If you extinguish every small fire, the thing collapses, okay? Well, we are aware of it in our own domains. If you put a child in a sterilized environment for 15 and a half years, no germs, right? And then he will be very healthy, no? And then put him in a New York subway. What would happen? You see what would happen? All right, so depriving systems, things that are anti-fragile of stressors or harm or whatever you want, makes them weaker. And this is a common mistake that comes from not understanding anti-fragility. And incidentally, that phone call, we have decided on the subtitle of the book, The Necessity of Disorder. Okay, the things that are like disorder. Bailing out companies is not a good thing, because what you're doing is delaying a larger collapse later, instead of letting things the natural way fail fast, early, and at minimum harm to others. So let me find, now I'm going to, we have a very easy way to string all these together with a technique to detect fragility and antifragility. Okay? And that explains why what is fragile doesn't like volatility, what is antifragile loves volatility, and why we can, I was an option trader for 20 years, why we can use all these things. Derivatives are a bad thing. They've been bad for society, but at least here they're useful for something, okay, to show who is short volatility and who's long volatility. So in the Midrash Tehillim, in sort of Talmudic, not quite Talmudic literature, there is a story of a king who has to punish his son by crushing him with this big stone. But of course, the king doesn't have any intention of killing his son, so he had a quandary. And the quandary was solved by an advisor. And what did the advisor recommend? What do you think he did? So, exactly. Small pebbles. You break up the stone in small pebbles, and you pelt the king's son with the pebbles. It's time-consuming, it takes hours, and everybody's happy. All right. The punishment went as dictated by the law, and the king's son was safe. All right, and except that someone had to spend a lot of time cutting stones. Anyway, so from here we have a very simple lesson, which is as follows. For the fragile, very simple, you have a nonlinearity. This is the harm, size of stone, event size of stone, and the harm. The harm is nonlinear. If you look at the size of the stone, harms the son of the king, all right, and then disproportionately nonlinear in a nonlinear way. In other words, 100 pounds would be more than 100 times as harmful as 1 pound. Okay, we have a definition of fragility. If I mean, you can try the experiment if you want. Take your car and drive it against the wall 100 times at 1 mile per hour, or do it 1,000 times at 1/10 of a mile per hour, and then compare. Try it once at 100 miles per hour. Okay, so you see what I mean here is that you have an increase in speed, an increase in something. So you have nonlinearity. Fragility comes from nonlinearity, with the proportionately larger impact. So this is exactly like what we call it short gamma as option trader. It's exactly what we call short volatility. It has a negative second derivative. Well, with this we could do a lot. Why is it that everything fragile has to be nonlinear? Well, very simple. Statistically, you have a lot more events of mild impact than events of large impact. If you were linearly fragile to jumping, or to shocks by jumping from some heights, then jumping from 10 meters would be as harmful as jumping 10,000 times 1 millimeter. I don't know if I got it right. Is it 1,000 times 1 millimeter or 1,000 times 1 centimeter? Who cares, all right? Okay. If it were otherwise, just walking to the office would kill you. You see? So harm has to come from the nonlinear. Fragility is in the nonlinear. Anything fragile to the linear would have been harmed from cumulative shocks. Like a coffee cup gets tons of shocks over its life. That one single, I don't know if there's one to experiment with here, but one single hit, of some intensity breaks it. But a lot of small hits don't cumulatively harm it. So with this, we can do a lot. The fragile is what has this curve. A very simple lesson, concave and convex. Well, we'll see how It's very easy to figure out the concave and convex using this graph. Okay? The concave is the one, this is the concave. This concave is no good. Convex is good. Concave, it means that disproportionately larger harm. Convex, disproportionately larger benefits. And we can use this to map anything. The rule is as follows. I have a variable. I wish I had a, I don't know, maybe it's here in the drawer? No, it's okay. You see the arrow, you are there. If the variable moves up by a certain amount, you're harmed more than you gain. If it moves down by a certain amount, you are concave, hence fragile. If the market goes up 10%, all right, you make $1 million, the market goes down 10%, you lose 10 million, you are concave, you see. Therefore, you are fragile. Very simple. So, upside versus downside. If your upside bigger than a downside, you're anti-fragile with respect to a source of randomness, and vice versa. With this, we can figure out, well, number one, why we had a crisis visibly. The system was driven to its nonlinear cusp, but the best comparison would be to traffic. You know, if you know where New York City is, Manhattan, okay, all right. Say you have 90,000 cars in New York, travel time, half an hour between point A and point B. You add 10,000 cars, travel time increases, but very little. You add 10,000 more cars, and then you hear honks, and you know the travel time now doubles. So nonlinearity is the reason why traffic has been a problem. I was last week in Sao Paulo. Coming in from the airport, 3 hours. Going back, it was Good Friday, you know, at 5 a.m., 28 minutes, all right? So you realize that they have too many cars. You realize, well, you're fragile to the number of cars. Well, that's the case with over-optimized systems. Have you heard of the airport called Heathrow in London? Okay. This was built by someone who forecast a certain number of traffic, not realizing that they were very concave to the number of flights, and it's so over-optimized that the smallest disruption causes 8, 10, 15-hour delays with people sitting on the floor playing guitars, and, you know, the kind of thing young people do in the summer when you have, airport delays. So with this, we can detect, very simply, you can detect fragility. You can detect model error. I take any model, increase a parameter 1%, decrease a parameter 1%, and see if I have more losses than gains, I'm fragile. If I have more gains than losses, I'm anti-fragile. If I'm anti-fragile in the long run, I'm going to be okay. Gain effectively from disorder. If I'm fragile in the long run, I'm going to be harmed. And beyond harm, I will no longer be around. Okay, part of the gene pool, whatever it is. So, another example. Let me give you another example. Well, this is too technical. I don't know how technical the crowd is, but I can get technical with my graph if someone asks a question. Let's look at Y size. Let's look at the size. A lot of people in economics talk about things called economies of scale. All right? You hear about it. It exists everywhere except in the data. You see? And the data doesn't exist. All right? Companies get large, and they're not more efficient, and effectively they tend to die. All right? So there is a problem. Why? Well, because as you get larger, you may be more efficient because you have higher, savings, and you have fewer secretaries, fewer this, fewer that, okay? But if there's a squeeze, you're harmed a lot more. This explains sort of why we don't have very large animals. An elephant is vastly more efficient than a mouse, metabolically. But we don't have a lot of elephants. We don't have a lot of animals of that size that I've seen, right, on land. So let's take the thought experiment. Have you heard what? There's a story with French Société Générale. Have you heard of it? I know it's a French bank. You guys don't care, but this is a very interesting story. Société Générale had a rogue trader. This fellow here who's a national hero in France. He may actually run for president one day, all right? So he's a national hero. His name is Kerviel. Jérôme Kerviel, very nice fellow. Now, where is this guy? Okay. Kerviel, it was discovered that Kerviel was hiding 50 billion euros. That's a lot of money. Even in today it was a euro where it is. Still a lot of money. 50 billion euros, like 65, 70 billion dollars, was hiding, in the drawer. He had bought stocks, and they discovered that, right? It was not a very pleasant thing, and they decided to liquidate. Given that it was in France, they thought they weren't aware of the existence of Martin Luther King, or at least that he had a holiday, right? That New York that Monday was closed. So they tried to liquidate the $50 billion, of course, the French way, which means 12 people dictating to one poor guy, one person liquidating and 12 people telling him what to do, all right? But whatever it was, they ended up losing $4 billion, 4 billion euros from the event, from liquidation, okay? So we can play the thought experiment, following the thought experiment, is if instead of having one large bank, you had 10 small banks, each one would have its mini Kerviel. They would still look like him, just as nice. Sorry, is there a way to place it? Yeah. This is technology, right? So instead of having one large bank, you had 10 small banks, and they would all have the same probability of having a rogue trader. So the rogue trader would have a tenth of the size, okay? It would have 10 times such event. Look at the net effect would be 0 losses. Why? Because if you're to liquidate, and I don't know if there are traders here, liquidating 50 billion euros, even on a regular day, and even if you did it the right way, would cost a lot of money. These are liquidation costs, very nonlinear. Liquidating 5 billion euros, all you need is 2 traders and 4 cups of coffee. And you tell them, you sip your coffee and you liquidate progressively. And when the coffee is finished, you should be finished liquidating. And guess what? 0 or minimal costs. So you realize that you have diseconomies of scale, stochastic diseconomies of scale, coming from size. That when a large event hits you. Now, I don't know if you have pets as someone here, there's a lot of people come from countries that have elephants. If you have an elephant as a pet, okay, things will be okay on a regular day. But if you have a shortage of water, you'd have to pay up a lot more per liter of water than if you had a mouse, no? Okay, so during squeezes, the costs go up non-proportionally. Well, this is one way to figure out. It's the same equation we used earlier. Okay, you have nonlinearity. It's very simple. Once you detect this concavity, this concave nonlinearity, you know you're in trouble. Well, we can apply this to a lot of things, but it looks like I don't see the watch. Okay, so it looks like I have an extra 5 minutes. Now we're going to move to a big problem. The problem we have today in society is that you have 2 classes of people. You have the class of people making the upside, but having no downside from the risks, and a class of people who have the downside for the risk of others, but no upside from it. You agree? This is we saw from the crisis, and this is continuing. At no time in history have we had so much what I call transfers of antifragility. And let me explain. Antifragile means you benefit from volatility. You have the upside, you benefit from volatility. If you look at the stock market, when I calculated it about a few months ago, had lost over $3 trillion because over the past 12 years, okay? Because, companies have been issuing at all prices, okay? Higher than here and lower than here as well, but mostly higher than here, been issuing stocks. And retirees and investors lost about close to $3 trillion cumulatively. Fund managers are paid, but only when they do well. You agree? It's called incentive, and people have the illusion that such incentive is part of the capitalistic system. Okay? So you would say that, okay, since the stock market lost about $3 trillion net, after financing, that you'd have no incentive, no? How much were incentives given to, not fund managers, company managers? Negative 400 million? No, how much? $400 billion positive. Why? Because it's very simple. If we split this room into, we have managers in this room, half of you go long the market, and half of you go short the market. Okay? And you're paid an incentive at year end. Half of you will make money. Those who make money will get a bonus. And those who lose money, what will they get? Nothing. There's no malice, all right? Okay. Well, that's counter to everything since what we call Western civilization has started. And let's go to the beginning of Western civilization. Does anyone recognize this gentleman here? Sorry? Hammurabi, all right? Okay. Hammurabi's law, you can go visit the Louvre and you see the law, and I'm sure that this law had to precede this concept, Hammurabi, is as follows. If the architect builds a house and the house collapses and kills the owner of the house, the architect shall be put to death. Now, we're not, recommending such policy now, no, please, before, all right? But think about it. What is the logic behind Hammurabi's law? What do you think? Sorry?
Sound houses.
What the real thing is? No, the architect can hide risk in a better than anyone else. You see, in a thing. So it's the best, and the architect will know more about the risk than any regulator. That's central. No inspector will ever be able to know what's going on in the foundations of the house better than the architect himself. So it gives an incentive to the architect. It's the best risk management rule ever. It's called skin in the game, the best risk management rule. Well, we lost that. The limited liability company was not what Adam Smith had in mind. And effectively, you can see that wealth has not been generated by companies after, the owner is no longer the owner, but before. Adam Smith, figured out they can have this as an agency problem. There's moral hazard, agency problem. And let's see how it plays in finance. When I'm short an option at the expense of someone else. Sorry, I'm rushing like this. Okay, very simple. Let's say that these are all profits, okay? The first few months are all profits, and the rest is a big loss. You make. And every year you make money, you have a bonus. That's what bankers had. And when there's a loss, as what happened in 2008, who eats it? Sorry? Shareholders first, and then who else? You, taxpayers. Robert Rubin, made $120 million in bonuses from Citibank. Citibank lost more than they ever made. They were going to be in receivership. I know from the inside. He kept his $120 million. Now you guys are paying actively for it. Okay? And these risks were hidden risks. bets on low probability events, detectable for anyone who knows about fragility. You can figure out there's something that's fragile. And someone's making these bets. And actually, there was an incentive to have these hidden risks, particularly if you don't have what I call skin in the game. So we have moved from an environment in which skin in the game was the only risk management to an environment where technology is a risk management. It doesn't work. You cannot be, and then I have my rule is you shall not be long an option, hidden option at anyone else's expense. We have that. Effectively, we're moving even into a new kind of world, vastly worse. At no time in history did we have people who had a high rank in society and did not take personal risks. Right? It's not like war was not a video game like in George W. Bush's days. All right? You can generalize this outside finance to everything. You have declare war, first in battle, as commander-in-chief, pre-technology, pre-modernism. So we have this loss of skin in the game is very generalized. And the crisis happened. I just wrote a paper. I wrote two papers on this topic. The first one called The Black Swan of Cairo, in which I explain how stifling volatility in these countries like Egypt, will cause blow-ups. And Saudi Arabia now, of course, we're contributing. And the second one is the first title was Why Did the Crisis Happen? And then I changed it more to be more prescriptive, how to avoid another crisis. By saying the problem we had is a combination of scientism, bogus scientism, and absence of skin in the game on the part of all operators. Now, we've been teaching methods in finance called portfolio theory. How many of you have studied these methods? Okay. You all know they don't work, no? Okay. They keep teaching them, and they keep teaching them. And they're the biggest intellectual fraud you can imagine, right? Because these portfolio constructions don't work. You're endangering people. There's, of course, no FDA. But why do people keep teaching them? Because a professor has the upside of giving you a nice equation and doesn't have any downside if you blow up. Very simple. Okay? So the idea to generalize skin in the game, you have to generalize skin in the game, all right? So via the legal system, via other techniques, and I like what I call heuristics and simple solutions to these classes of problems. I think I'm pretty much done, but let me finish with a picture of Hammurabi, and a lot of things will come up in questions here in the Q&A. Let me put Hammurabi, all right? And finish with Hammurabi. Incidentally, I want to mention one thing before I finish, since we have someone. It's the same thing with iatrogenics. When you're very ill, you are like long an option medicine, because the harm of the medicine is not going to harm you much. Let me give you a very simple example. There's something called numbers needed to treat, NNT, my initials. If you have very high blood pressure and you take medicine, the numbers needed to treat are 2 out of 3. It means out of 3 patients who take the medicine, 2 will benefit from it. But if you have a borderline high blood pressure, 1 in 24 patients will benefit from the drug. And of course, the pharma company will always benefit from the drug. So the numbers needed to treat, so it's very nonlinear. And if you ration drugs to those who are very ill, but these people give them even more than they want, okay, you would do both a favor, the one who's very ill and the one who's ill. Because what I call the iatrogenics is harm done by the healer. It is exactly, you're fragile if you're slightly ill and you take a drug. And you are like long volatility, anti-fragile. Sorry, if you're not very ill, you're fragile, all right? We give Lipitor to people not knowing the side effects. So it has this probability distribution. I don't know how technical you guys want to be, but this technique of looking at convexity effects and asymmetries applies directly to medical treatments, particularly if you look at it at a macro scale, how much we spend. And we have data, actually, we even have data for occurrences of hospitals that went on strike and focused only on eliminated elective surgery. And of course, people lived longer. I don't know whether they lived longer because of eliminated elective surgery or because maybe they did a better job with emergency treatments where most were needed. Anyway, so thank you very much for listening to me. And let me put back Hammurabi, and hopefully we can take Q&A. Thanks.
If there are questions, please come down to the mic. Students, priority, please.
Hi, my name is Christian. I'm an undergraduate studying financial engineering here at Princeton, and your book, The Black Swan, was one of the principal things that convinced me to study probability. So I'm just wondering, as an undergraduate here, how should I supplement my education to use your terminology, avoid becoming a nerd?
Okay. Probability and what we call someone focused on a very narrow domain, they don't go together very well because probability is very fragile to estimation errors. So two things, either avoid studying probability or if you study it, don't study a probability mathematically because it looks like for what we use it for in social science, it's just entertainment. Nothing else. And it's actually harmful. It has iatrogenics. It is harmful.
Thanks. So if you consider insurance in general as kind of something that promotes fragility, isn't there also an increasing non-linearity when you take risks? So say you invested, you're going with the Google X Lunar Prize and you're trying to invest in rockets that are going to the moon. If you only invest $10 in that, then you're not going to learn very much out of that.
I'm not, can you speak slowly?
Oh, yeah. So so it also seems on the opposite end that there's a non-linearity in the investments that you make and the risks that you take. So if you're only risking a small amount of money on such a grand prize, then you're not going to get very much out of it. But if you're investing 10 times as much, then you may
No, that's not the way to look at it. Because when you look at the portfolio, you look at your portfolio as a whole, right? So you got to split it into different investments. You have $100, how are you going to split how many investments you're going to have, okay? In a fat-tailed world, a world that has a lot of large deviations, you should have as many small investments as you can for these $100. In a world that doesn't have fat tails, you do what the Markowitz portfolio theory, then you would invest in a small number of investments for which you think you're comfortable, about the return. So it's a very different methodology, but non-linearity is not the point.
Hi. Being a huge fan of your aphorisms, so one of my favorites being a good listener is someone with skillfully polished indifference. I really liked the bed of Procrustes, but since now you don't have a Twitter account, where do you keep the aphorisms and where can we find them?
I don't, no, you buy it in the store. This is like, no, I put aphorisms. I wrote aphorisms just as a literary exercise, about 500 of them over a certain period of day. I thought it was going to take me 500 days. It took me about 60 days to write 500 of them. And I published them as a book.
Yeah, that's right. But
you can buy the book.
No, after reading the book, you still have new aphorisms, I guess. And
no, I don't. I've stopped. Or if I have aphorism, it's not published. I thought that they want to get it for free because people used to Twitter wants everything for free. Go ahead.
I have a question about the implications of your worldview with respect to what it means to, let's talk about banks, for example. So banks. So if we manage everything for the tail risk, the black swan, the implication would seem to me be that if a bank had $10 billion in capital, it could only really make $10 billion in loans because we have to assume that any one loan could go, to zero. And we don't want to do bailouts because you say they're bad. So we end up with we eliminate fractional reserve banking, and the implications for the size of the economy are somewhat significant. And I wish you would just comment on that.
Okay, very good. He's telling me that if someone used my idea of perfect robustness, seeking perfect robustness, then you would not let banks lend more than their capital, all right? And that would be very bad for the economy. Let's go to the banks and explain. Number one, just reducing the leverage of banks would be a good benefit. But let's look at what the banks do, all right? Banking is a very strange business. They're involved in lending. You agree? All right. So is lending a good thing or a bad thing? Who thinks that lending is a good thing? Okay. You think that lending is a good thing, therefore that economic growth came from lending. Who thinks economic growth came from lending? Okay. Who thinks that the innovation and all that came from thanks to lending to people who were involved in these things? Okay, all right. If you look at the history of lending and history of banking, you'll realize the following. Industrial revolution takes off. Lending comes when companies no longer need the money. Okay? And then for the manager, and the lending increases dramatically when the manager of the company is no longer the owner and start, gambling with society's money. Let's take the numbers here. Number one, if you want, you have Apple computers up there. How much debt does Apple have? Okay, there you go. Now, I don't know if you remember what happened in 2000. For those of you who could read in 2000, I don't know, this was a long time ago, all right? The students, all right? In 2000, we had a collapse in California. How much debt were there? 0. It was all equity, all right? Okay, so economic growth doesn't come from debt, except a portion of it is repaid back when you pay back the debt. Okay, so it looks like, debt, I'm talking speculative debt. You have different forms of debt. You have debt for letters of credit, debt for non-speculative purpose, and then, of course, speculative debt, all right? Or debt to lending companies to take some classes of risk. In history, you go back to this fellow, all right, the Babylonians. They discovered the ills of debt that it blew up society. What happens is, creates bad habits, and of course, almost every civilization we've had has ended up either banning or severely curtailing debt. Whether you talk about Islam, Catholicism. Catholicism had a ban of debt more severe than Islam. I don't know I wonder what happened in Ireland, all right? But it was Aquinas, if you read Aquinas, the fatwa is much stronger than Islam. Okay? So almost all civilization figured out the point. So this myth that we need debt to grow, you need debt to grow cosmetically, and it's a very fragile type of growth. And of course, debt leads to a culture of debt that is not very good. Okay. So does this answer the question? Now, what banks should do, if you had equity rather than debt, the right way, this conversation would be irrelevant because the banks would not play such a large role. When you don't have debt, banks don't play a very large role. Today we have between 3 and 6 times the amount of debt to GDP in Western countries as we did in 1980. So you realize why the finance sector is very big, and the finance sector is like a compensation scheme. Another piece of data, when I wrote The Black Swan, I wrote that by 1982, money center banks in America lost more money than ever made in the history of banking. Okay? And one day, one quarter, of course, cosmetic, hiding of it. And sure enough, I got a lot of hate mail. This is the past, this will never happen again. And of course, it was hate mail I got. It was published in 2007. It used to say that 5 trillion, if you were to mark the market properly, were lost in 2007, 2008, during that period. So if you want more convincing, that what debt has done is mostly allow some class of people to become rich, not the banks, investors, mostly a certain number of real estate speculators. Like Donald Trump, remember, he went bust. He's rich now. Manny Hanny is bust. Manufacturers Hanover for those who read financial history. So there's something about debt that is very strange. It's a big myth about the role of debt. And traditionally, governments have borrowed to wage war. Okay, so and I think nothing has changed. If now we're paying for largely between 1 and 2.2 trillion for the past war. Okay, so now you understand why I don't like debt, and why we should be very careful. And this conversation about the size of about banks wouldn't take place in an environment where we have more equity and healthier economic climate. More questions?
I guess, but don't you agree that the way you're looking at the world, that a bank would only be able to lend?
No, I am not. No, not really.
Would only be able to lend the amount of equity it has because it has to manage for the tail? I'm just asking. I mean, it's a serious question.
This is taking it to the extreme because you want to prevent banks from lending. You don't want then banks shouldn't exist. You can just go buy a bond, you see. The idea is to prevent banks from playing a very large role in society, okay, through lending, speculative lending, because the balance sheets don't come from things that are healthy. But I'm not against fractional reserve banking. You have to look at what the loans are made for. Okay, are these loans for speculative reasons, or are they car loans or loans, that are very controllable and help at a small scale economic activity? Plus, the other thing is there's a difference between the risk of banks. I've answered a similar question, like with insurance companies. There are two types of insurance. There's insurance that is from, I call it mediocre stand, because the risks are uncorrelated and small. Insurance, for example, on health insurance and stuff like that. And then there are reinsurance that are lumpy. The problem of the banks is that most of the loans are very correlated. And they're invited, beyond a certain level, to get engaged into very correlated loans, rather idiosyncratic risks that are hedgeable and diversifiable. No more questions? Well, because there's one. Yeah, all right.
Quick follow-up question, just to stake out kind of your position on debt. Does your sort of debt skepticism extend to forms of debt which seek to benefit from anti-fragile systems, for example, like venture capital?
Well, okay, let me, first of all, venture capital is never debt, all right? It has never been debt. But I put in a triad here, I put debt in two places, all right? Okay, the fragile is, debt is fragile relative to equity, okay? But this is a relative scale, okay? It's like a spectrum. But if you see the second line, the second entry, public debt is the mother of all fragilities. Public debt is very dangerous because public debt is never repaid. If you merge that with my idea of size, and you'll see that the problem with government is that with the scale of the government is because the projects, let's apply this idea of size. $100 million project will have overruns that are about 4 times, on balance, those of a 10 million, even if you scale, 10 times 10 million projects, you see? And that is the problem with public debt, is that it's much more concave to errors. I'm writing something with the IMF, trying to look at concavity of government deficits. They're very concave, because they're concave in the sense that if unemployment goes up 1%, their deficit worsens a lot more than if it improves if unemployment goes down 1%, or some other elements that enter their deficit. Particularly if their feedback on interest rates of their existing debt making things worse. So government debt is very bad. If I were to view the world, and to say, the world has never been richer today in history. The world as a whole. And almost every country today is richer, not Greece, but almost every country today is richer than it was 10 years ago. And that was even last year, believe it or not, okay, in the aggregate for a country. And for some strange reason, okay, we're like rich people who need to borrow. Well, when you get rich, you should usually have less reason to borrow, and we're borrowing more than ever. This is a big problem. So if a very simple heuristic, if you want to have a healthy economy, number one, prevent governments from running deficits. Make them shoot for surplus so you can get a small deficit, if any. And the second one, decentralization, because municipalities are better at forecasting their expenditure than centralized governments. Thanks. Yeah.
Could you summarize your year and a half ago Economist article in terms of the key things that would be and would not be broken by 2036?
Yeah, I used the methodology. I had used that technique to say that the banks would collapse. The Fannie Mae would go bust, right? I had used that technique before that Economist article. But in it, they asked me what would be broken, all right? I told them what is fragile needs to be broken. And of course, even with government bailouts, you can't be larger than a market. You can bail out. Eventually, something will be collapsed. I think major banks today will all be broken. Banks today will all go bust. The banks that you walk outside, you see the name of the bank. Odds are it will be off outside the gene pool. Banks, all right, predicting what will go away in the future. The Federal Reserve Bank of the United States will not exist under its present form. It's too fragilizing, and itself, you can't. You can fool some people for a while, but you can't fool them forever. All right. The bonus without malice will not survive. I don't know if I said that in the article. What will survive, just using that Lindy effect as a heuristic, the bicycle will survive. And today we'll produce more bicycles than cars, and it's faster growing than cars, except China, where it was the opposite before. The bicycle will survive. The car will survive. The wall-to-wall bookshelf will survive, to tell you what we think about the book. Not because these reading things aren't good, but because it's too unstable, the technology. And what else did I add in it? And I said the economic establishment, the existing economic establishment, quantitative economics particularly, will look at them the way we look at Miss Bray, fortune teller in Lower East Side of New York. We'll talk about them that way. That was my article. He's an economist. He looks like an economist. Are you an economist?
Yeah, I'm a junior in the economics department.
Yeah, very good. You look like you can tell. Right? You can tell.
How do you think economics and finance should be taught in the classroom, and what role should quantitative analysis play both in the classroom and in the real world?
I just wrote an article in the New York Times. I don't write articles often. My articles are typically 300 words, which means that you can do them standing up. And I just wrote one in the New York Times. And they said, how should we teach economics? I said, there's a certain class of economics that should not be teaching. And if you want to do something else, teach gardening instead. They're better for society. No, because they're harmful. And how can you identify them? Second order effects. And let me show you what we did here. Very simple. I have a technique to identify them. I don't have a technique to identify it. Okay, no, I have the paper here. Convexity to perturbation of parameters. Very simple. I can tell if a model has second order effect by taking the parameters and their parameters that are fixed, making them stochastic. The paper is on the web. Okay? So you can tell what models make you blow up from black swans and which ones are robust. All of classical economics survive. Everything done that has equations in it over the past 50 years, almost everything, is bust. You see? That simply take Markowitz, for example. If you expand the model to make some parameters held to be constant, make them stochastic, the model reverses conclusions. So it's on the web. What makes you black swan prone? What you do better without a model. So economic thinking is doesn't change. It has survived the test of time. It's what has been done since Samuelson optimization. That goes bust once you expand the model to perturbate parameters or introduce fat tails. or make probabilities of the tail uncertain. And it's very simple. They're called fragility to parameter. And I used it to show why Fukushima, computation done for Fukushima was faulty. They said this event should happen 1 in a million years. Okay? If you perturbate the parameters a little bit, it happens every 30 years. Okay? These are the models that go out the window, and you can identify them by perturbation parameter to see if they're nonlinearities. I wish I had the graph here. It's very simple. If you start applying it, econometrics is out the window. Some things survive, of course, that have quantitative, and everything literary in economics, take Hayek, no equation survives. So strange. Right. And you can show that quantitatively by taking the equations themselves and expanding them. By putting what I call a second layer of uncertainty. So it looks like we're, so thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here.